Thank you very much. It's always good to be ahead of schedule. I feel a little bit challenged by the fact that I'm actually talking to people who know more about this topic than what I do. Generally, when you're in a panel or discussion, I actually feel quite confident, but here I'm going, uh-oh, I'm now in trouble. But maybe like the one area which I might have a little bit more, let's say, comparative advantage on it is about talking about people. And I've got a speech and I'll go through the speech, which I'll read very badly. But I think this is where it's super important that we look at how important you are, how important a stakeholder you are. I'm here because you have probably got more influence per capita than almost anyone else dealing with the climate crisis. And just in the last week, I was in Abu Dhabi, I was in the other Gulf states, I was in Baku, I was in New York. And that's not just to say how bad my carbon footprint was, but it was my attempt to try and see how we could influence the negotiations going into COP and beyond in a way which better reflected the needs of the populations. And was I successful? I think absolutely not. So I'm here to try and implore that you do whatever you can to bring the human consequences of the climate crisis to the fore. That it's not just the politicians, it's not just industry, it's not administrations, it's the people that can influence what's going on. And it's the people who actually are seeing the impacts. We mentioned, and I will go back to the speech at one point, we mentioned Hurricane Mitch. And you see the roads clogged because people are heading out from Florida. They've got an opportunity to move. They've got the capacity to move. They've got the resources to move. They've got a government which is fairly functional to provide them with the necessary protection. But just imagine if you're in Sudan and you've just fled to Chad, to Eastern Chad, if anyone's ever been there, or if you're going from Myanmar to Bangladesh, or you're fleeing from Venezuela to Brazil, and you're being faced with those similar types of situations. And that's what we do. This is what UNHCR and our partners do. We deal with those people who are most vulnerable. And again, this is not in my speech, but like just listening to how the introductions were, I think we have to be sort of like, statistics are out there, but people don't really listen to these statistics, unfortunately. And I've been using statistics, I've been using trends, I've been sort of saying how dire the situation is, but it's the human-centric side of things that we need to be bringing to the fore. And just recently, I was on the border between Somalia and Kenya. There was refugee women coming across the border into Kenya. And one of the women that I spoke to, she had 5 children. 2 of them died en route. And so she ended with 3 children. Her husband had left her, married somebody else, moved somewhere else. So she was there in a refugee camp in Kenya with nothing, really nothing, except her children. And she said, look, like, we just need to start again. And then I was asking her, what would it take for you to go back? And I said, peace, land, house. And she said, no, education for our kids, healthcare for our kids, a future for our kids. And I suppose is what's going to be key when I eventually do get to my presentation is that we bring it back to the future. Not so much about us, not so much about where we are now, but where do we want the world to be? How do we want these countries to be? Do we wish them to be dependent? Do we wish them to have a dignified, safe, prosperous future? Because this is what you have an opportunity to influence. It's not that we can do everything simply and in one fast swoop. God knows, not when we deal with refugees and crises. But how I used to approach dealing with refugee situations that used to be almost felt insurmountable was, look, if we can just do one thing at a time, it might just add like a 0.1% change. But if we just do it more and more and more, it adds up. And that's what I think what journalists can also do. One story, one interview may not make the difference, but if you create a momentum, if you create a synergy, if you create have a common objective about what is the world that we want, you can all contribute. And it can't just be one person, it has to be everyone. And it can't be just a white Australian male sitting up in Copenhagen telling you about it. You need to be talking to the people who are experiencing it. You need to be talking to Fatima, who crossed the border from Somalia into Kenya. You need to be talking to the Kenyans who have opened up the land and said, okay, you are welcome. What have you, a climate scientist, journalist? So you would know that Chad on the ND Gain Index is probably the most vulnerable country in the world in terms of being able to adapt to the climate crisis. The most vulnerable. I think it's 187 out of 187 in the ND Gain Index. It's accepted 700,000 Sudanese refugees. That's on top of another 800,000 that's already had in the past. And for those people who know how fragile the Sahel is, don't tell me that Europe is being challenged when you've got countries like this who are doing the right thing. Anyway, that was not my speech. Now you know why I don't get invited very often. So obviously, thanks a million for letting me be here. It's the issues of climate and misinformation, super important for us, particularly when you're sort of facing, actually I should just throw this away, particularly like when you're facing the challenges that we are around the world. And it's not just in Europe that you've got increased xenophobia and misinformation, disinformation, malinformation, but so many places you've got no information. And as I was explaining, we'll be inundated about the situation of Hurricane Mitch, but if a similar situation hit Malawi or Zimbabwe or Nairobi, or Kenya or Tanzania, would we get that type of information? So next week I've got to do a presentation on climate change and equity, and I suppose this is what's key. We need to treat people as people. Everyone has a right for information, but they also have a right to have their situation and their stories told. And as Vera mentioned, like, storytelling is so important. And at some point in my speech, I'll be saying what you lack may be access to those people, but that's what we have. We have about 500 offices around the world in the most godforsaken parts of the world, because this is where refugees often end up. So if you want support, if you want help in terms of getting access to populations that are being impacted by conflict or by climate, we're there to help. Not help, that's patronizing. we're there to partner. Anyway, there goes the first page. So in terms of misinformation, disinformation, malinformation, no information, it's obviously key that we're talking about it, but it's also increasingly recognized. I forget who mentioned it at the start, but the issue may not be necessarily so recognized at the moment, but it's only going to become more important. Like whether it be the climate crisis, whether it be the issue of climate induced conflict, whether it be the human dimension, it can only become more important. And this is where you need to be, without sort of telling you what to do, where you need to be the, not just advocates, you need to be sort of like you need to be so passionate without sort of, you need to be taking the lead. You can't be waiting for anyone else. You almost can't be waiting for the audience to demand these stories. You have to be setting the scene, because these stories will be demanded in the future. If you look at also the World Economic Forum, which is not necessarily the traditional partner for someone like UNHCR, The World Economic Forum, as you know, is largely based on supporting the private sector. But what we've been able to do, and this is again sort of an indicator about how things are changing, is that the World Economic Forum has increasingly taken on not just the security element and the impact of climate crisis, but the human security element of the climate crisis. And they're also particularly increasingly concerned in terms of what misinformation, disinformation is doing in terms of compromising global security. So here, for those people who are aware of the Global Risks Report released annually by the World Economic Forum, they've noted that some of the most significant risks we will face over the next decade is misinformation, disinformation. As well, we've got extreme weather events. So you've got extreme weather events, you've got misinformation, you've got disinformation. Additionally, armed conflict has emerged as a new entrant in the risk rankings, serving as both a product and a driver of state fragility over the next 2 years. So what we're talking about here has been already recognized by the World Economic Forum as being key across all their audiences. What these risks highlight is the precarious position of the vulnerable populations that UNHCR works with and for, and who finds themselves at the intersection of these layers of risks. I've had this role for the last 4 years, and I've had the privilege to travel to scores of countries who have been impacted by the climate crisis and by conflict. And what I generally find, without exception, it is those countries that are generally the poorest and most vulnerable who are the most welcoming to refugees. It sort of goes against what everyone would be generally thinking. But if you talk about Chad, if you talk about Mauritania, if you talk about Colombia, Niger, Mozambique, Bangladesh, and Brazil, they're doing things which many countries in the West would find untenable. They give access to citizenship for people who have fled due to conflict or climate. They provide access to livelihoods for work. They provide land because they understand that you cannot have a regional security unless you also provide human security. And so this is the type of things that we're working with governments to inform them not only that the current situation is quite challenging, but the only way to address future security and human security is by putting in place the necessary laws, policies, and programs, but also trying to solicit sufficient funding that will enable those populations who are so generously hosting refugees and others to not be seen to be further imperiled. So whether it's the recent flooding in the Eastern Horn of Africa, Brazil, and Afghanistan, there's increasing examples of how extreme weather events and disasters are shattering many refugees and other displaced communities worldwide, worsening their plight and in some cases forcing them to move onwards and start from zero again. You'd be seeing a lot of discussions in Europe about, my God, we're going to be having so many people coming up to the north because that's what's going to be the impact of climate change. Well, probably, but you've also got an opportunity to do something about it. But people do not necessarily want to leave their homes and their communities and their countries. They much prefer to stay where they are in dignity and safety and have a future for their children. But if you have a response in a place like Chad, which has absorbed 1.5 million refugees, or maybe, sorry, it's not 1. It's probably about 1 million refugees, then, sorry, only 1 million, and our funding is about 10 or 15%, well, hello, of course people will try and move, but they won't move necessarily north. They'll move to where they can find work. They'll probably move to the west coast of Africa. They'll move to capital cities. So when we go and talk about refugees, when we go talk about climate, and we hear this fear-mongering, tell them to stop it and understand why people are moving. People are moving for their children. People are moving to ensure their dignity. People are moving to ensure their safety. Much like people are moving out of Florida at the moment. Much like many of your relatives or ancestors would have moved during the Second World War and before. Like, being a refugee is not a stigma that people should be ashamed of. Refugees are being forced to move because of no fault of their own. But we have got, and particularly in Europe, you've got the means to do something about it. And I'm not saying wait for people to move. I'm saying support those people who are most vulnerable. And those populations that are most vulnerable are being made increasingly vulnerable because of the impacts of climate change. And why is words important? Because if you use the wrong words, you reinforce the scapegoating, the xenophobia, the belief that people are moving because they want to, that they want to go somewhere else. No, refugees are forced to move because they've got 1 minute to go. Okay, this will be short. Okay, so I'll just say what a refugee is very quickly. Refugees are individuals who have fled their homes to escape persecution, conflict, violence, serious human rights violations, and other events seriously disturbing public order. This is not migrants. So a refugee is somebody who crosses an international border and who has really no choice about it. And it's because of conflict and violence. A migrant, for instance, and a refugee is covered under international law. So this is what UNHCR has got a mandate from the United Nations General Assembly to ensure the protection of refugees. Migrants are not as specifically defined under international law, but the term has been used to refer to people who choose to move across borders, not because of any direct threats of persecution, serious or harm or death, but exclusively for other reasons, including for work, education, or family reunification. However, the use of words becomes slightly more difficult when adding other complex factors, such as escaping hardships due to environmental disasters. So what I want to say within my 30 seconds is that be careful in how you frame populations on the move. When you talk about climate refugees, technically there's no such term as climate refugees, but it's quite a sexy term. It's like you can't get that sort of image in less than 2 words. So I don't mind using the word. It's not within UN speak. But the other issue, but the challenge is if we refer to everyone as climate refugees, you devalue and minimize what the real refugees require, which is protection from conflict. So for instance, if people, and I'm sure it's going to be everywhere in the news, you've got these climate refugees from Cyclone Mitch. They're not refugees. People fleeing from Sudan are refugees. People fleeing from the DRC are refugees and in need of international protection. People fleeing from Ukraine are refugees. So we have to make sure that we maintain and protect the word refugees, those people crossing international border in need of international protection, while at the same time recognizing that the climate crisis will increasingly, I'm just waiting for the sign to go up saying, finished, get out of here. While trying to maintain that the climate crisis will aggravate existing grievances and vulnerabilities and cause conflict. There's no doubt about it, but there's the direct correlation between, okay, climate change and conflict, it's not there. You need a number of elements in between. Generally poor governance, generally challenge over resources and other elements. Why do some countries go into conflict while facing the same issues related to climate crisis and others do not? These are the types of things which we're looking at. I'll just go through the last 4 pages very quickly. No, I won't. Okay, so I'm going to say the call for action, and I don't care. So it's basically saying, we need you. So don't underestimate how important your role is and how important we see your role is. So we're on the humanitarian front lines. We've got 20,000 staff, as I said, working in these places where no one has probably even heard of. And we need their work. We need the voices of the people that they're working with to be raised and to be brought forward to events such as COPs. We need to ensure that these COPs don't run for another 29 COPs with no sizable impact on those populations which are so desperate for change, because we can't afford it. Anyway, so there. Do I answer the questions? Okay. So I hope you enjoyed my speech. Oh, there's also photos. I also had some photos which were not. So this is the type of situation which is on the camp in Kenya, Amina from Somalia. So if people like, so it could be Amina, it could be Fatima, it could be any number of, but what we've generally found is that women such as this who crossed the border generally were displaced 4 or 5 times within Somalia before they crossed the border. And so the general situation is that many of the men will join Al-Shabaab because they've got no choice. And Al-Shabaab will be paying between $10 and $50 per month. The women will be left. They will make their to other places within Somalia, but then they'll be just basically bounced around between drought and flood until then they say, okay, we're moving across the border to Kenya. And so are they refugees? Absolutely, because they're initially uprooted because of conflict. Were they eventually moved? Did they forced across the border because of climate change and drought? Yes. So it's incredibly difficult to be able to sort of like get the key elements of attribution about why people are crossing. But are they in need of international protection? Absolutely. Are there stories worth being told? Absolutely. So these are the types of things which we have to basically deal with on a daily. Thank you. Yep, that's it. Done. Okay, questions, is it? No question? Yep.
Hi, my name is Rona. I'm a journalist and also work in Grant World. What's the one thing you see that you think journalists need to change when they're engaging with nonprofits or multilateral agencies like yours? I'll give an example. We tend to find that multilateral agencies, not yours, just saying, they have a script, especially, I'm going to speak technically, especially when it's visual journalism.
Visual.
Yeah, videos, social media. I see some heads nodding. You all know what I'm talking about. And because of that visual, which speaks to language, which you've just said, there's a bit of trying to control, all in the name of embedding. So what steps are you taking to sort of eradicate that, if there are any steps you are taking? But more importantly, what can we do to make that relationship work better for the people who are reporting on?
Yep, it's a good question. I went through the key principles of journalists yesterday, and it's about truth and accuracy, independence. Sorry, without pointing at you, independence, fairness, impartiality, humanity and respect for others, and accountability. You've just got to follow that. Like the impartiality, the fairness, the objectivity. To give you an example, so I was responsible, going back almost a decade now, to setting up 2 of the biggest refugee camps in the world, in Jordan, Zatri and Azraq. There is no way in hell that I knew what was going on in the camps, because there was 120,000 in one camp and there was 50,000 in the next. And at one point, we're having 5,000 people cross the border every day. There was 80 buses, and we had to put in place tents for 5,000 people every day. So you just imagine what was going on. Did I have a chance to understand what was going on in the camp? No. Like it was there child marriages going on? Was there trafficking going on? Was there abuse going on? Was things running okay? No. What I did do was I basically let the camp open for all journalists, and I had to negotiate with the government to do that. And so before a scandal would occur, a journalist would come to me and sort of say, did you know that this child marriage is going to take place the following day? So I always had a heads up from the journalists about where things before, like the fuse was going. And I needed you to be telling me what was not working. And if I ignored them, then boom. But I don't think we had a huge scandal or like there's like when you have almost 200,000, we had 700,000 people cross. Like, so it's not so much an issue of managing. I'd actually turn it the other way and say, how do we work with you for you to tell us what's not working? So as soon as anyone starts, like if someone's critical of me, which absolutely, I deserve to be criticized, I generally say, okay, what would you do? Tell me how I could do this better, or maybe let's go to the government, or let's go on a mission together. Because I think that sense of objectivity is super important, and independence. So like if you get sort of videos being provided by any agency, you're right, there is a set standard because we employ journalists and they've gone through the same sort of guidelines and trainings as you all have. And this is what they produce because this is what they think it will sell. But this is why I think it's so important for you to join us and go on mission and see what is actually the situation there. Because one of the reasons why the issue of goodwill ambassadors is becoming more and more important is that it's not that it's a challenge to get agencies to be accepted for what they say. We need people who already relate to society and communities and different audiences. So we've got people who have got no huge sort of like links to refugees in the past, but they've got a huge link to younger audiences. And so at the moment, we're looking at how do we influence younger audiences rather than politicians, because we think that the younger audiences are going to influence politicians in the future. So that's a long-winded way to sort of say, you happy? Okay. Next.
G'day, Andrew. It's nice to hear an Australian voice as well.
How did you get here?
Yeah, good question. Name's Grant, ex-CSIRO, Climate Science Centre. It's really interesting hearing the journalistic side of you and some of the work that you're doing. I'm wondering, in my past experience working in the Pacific on the Van Kierop project, I'm just wondering if what we found the most impactful for journalists and local people to understand how serious it was almost coming up with a new buzzword. And people love buzzwords in the kind of general public. I wonder if there's a word that can summarize the humanization of climate refugee in a new way, and that's maybe for the whole room as well, but a way that you can really portray how serious and the humanization is for someone to uplift and move because of climate impacts.
If I did have the right slogan, you would know about it. So that means I don't. Because it's like they're relatively boring because we're a protection agency, and so we have to and we're a UN agency, so everything we have has to follow protocols, as Joanna is saying. So like what we do say is the climate crisis is a human crisis. Because so we try and it's also a coral crisis, it's a glacial crisis, it's a sea level crisis, but the issue for us is bring it back down to people and try and ensure that there's that human perspective. And so like if you talk, thankfully there's not that much conflict in the South Pacific or Pacific, but you see some of the best images are of, it's not, I've got to be careful, like it's graves going underwater and what that represents, like cultures being lost, people having no choice. Like the most sacrosanct areas of community is your ancestors. And if you can't protect that, what hope do you have? And then you have the Prime Minister or the Secretary General sort of wading through water on a podium. Like you need to have that sort of like stark images. Like I've said, you've got to almost slap people in the face and sort of say, wake up. But then I got in trouble when I said slap people in the face. But, but it's like you really do need to shake people up. But this is also, like, this is where we need your advice. Like, you guys are the experts. Like, if we don't get the traction in sort of saying, look, like people are suffering, then tell us what makes sense. Again, it's got to be, because like this issue is so existential to everyone's future existence that it can't just be UNHCR or Denmark or an NGO. It's got to be, how do we all get to it? And so it's good that you mentioned CSIRO, because data and evidence is super important. So we're working a lot with CGIR, because I can come up with data and people sort of say, well, Harper, you don't know what you're talking about. But if you get CGIR, who's got a budget of about $900 million and 9,000 agricultural scientists, and they're working with us to say, give you an example. Ethiopia, and we're going to put out a report just before COP. Ethiopia, we've got 38 displacement centres, not us, but there's 38 displacement camps in Ethiopia. At the moment, 1 out of that 38 is experiencing or rated as having severe or extreme compounded hazards. 1 out of 38. By 2040, and this is work from CGIR, Oregon State and Montana State Universities, we expect 34 of those settlements to be experiencing heat and compounded hazards that will be threatening to human life. That's the type of challenges that we're being faced with. So one thing which I want to do is to try and ensure that politicians and decision makers can't say we didn't know. And so they've got money, there is money out there. Are they prepared to make the decisions to save human lives in a place like Ethiopia? Or will they put it somewhere else because it fits their stereotypes? I want people to be uncomfortable. Don't quote me on that. Next.
We'll take a last question. Anyone?
Hi, I'm Sonara Vetch. I work for a Danish organization called the Constructive Institute. Just kind of, you were saying journalists need to tell us what we need to look at, like point the holes in what we're doing. But could I flip that and say, what can you tell us journalists that is working in the refugee space? What needs to be done? Point to hope and ways forward, because as you've mentioned, with climate change, we're going to get more refugees, everything's going to be exacerbated. And you can do endless stories about Fatima in a refugee camp, but there's only so many times that people can see that on their screens. Mm-hmm. What can UNHCR or other agencies show us about the possibilities moving forward rather than just the problems?
I would say, going back to, again, just demonstrating that I did some research, in terms of the principles, accountability. Like one key element for journalists is to hold, there was a saying in Australia which was, keep the bastards honest. And I think that's what journalists should also be doing. So if money is going out, let's say from the World Bank, from the Green Climate Fund, from the Danish government, to do climate work, we talked about the credits for offsetting carbon emissions. Really? So, like, how much of this money really gets to the women on the front line? And so it's about, does Denmark provide, okay, I'm not going to hit Denmark, I've got to see the government this afternoon. So do donors provide grants or do they provide loans? So you see all these governments and companies sort of saying how great they are, but what are they actually doing? Is it more for themselves? Like, are they planting trees in Norway or are they planting trees in Chad? I don't care about trees in Norway or Canada. Like, the trees will grow there anyway. What I need to do is to be investing in peace. And so I think like what will become increasingly important, because the amount of money available for humanitarian operations is getting less per capita. So we have to make sure that every dollar that is being provided to us gets to Fatima or Amina. It shouldn't be getting stuck, for instance, in a capital. So the issue of accessibility of funding, availability of funding, so accessibility, making sure that it's not too difficult for countries to get to it, availability, affordability. So I saw the other day that the UAE gave several $1 billion worth of loans to Kenya at 8.2%. How's that going to work with Kenya? Like, what is the world thinking? Does the UAE have enough money to provide more concessional loans? Should they give grants? Like Kenya is hosting, how many people Kenya hosting? Make something up. it's less than 1 million. Like I know the camps that I was 100 times up is 160,000. Like we need to be investing in peace. So I think challenge people in terms of the funding. Where is the funding going? Tree planting, classic example. When people plant trees, that is not the outcome that we want. What we want is a livelihood which also focuses on gender, and that these has an environmental impact. We don't want trees to be planted and then they become a goat feeding zone. So it's a long-term investment. So these are the types of things that I would read an article if you said that. Yeah.
Okay.
I think I've got to go. Yeah.